Good morning. Let me try that again. Good morning. Thank you. It's pretty packed out there. That's kind of cool. I'm really glad that everyone came to hear my talk today. When I first was approached about doing this talk, I was sort of reluctant to do it, largely because these are the sort of talks that people do at the end of their career, and my pulse was still beating. So I was a little reluctant to do it, but we'll see what happens. And I hope that you enjoy listening to some of the things that I've learned. So let me go ahead and get started with this. We're going to talk about perspectives on the evolution of HTML. And I think the first thing I should do is sort of introduce myself a little bit. This talk isn't about me, so we're not going to dwell on this, but it'll help you understand the rest of the talk. Originally, I was an innocent physicist, and my concerns were really about how the universe began, which is a small thing compared to the World Wide Web, but and not nearly as important, but that was where I started. And eventually, in 1990, I became involved in this internet thingy, and especially in the World Wide Web. And it's I've told Tim several times, Tim Berners-Lee, that it's all been downhill ever since. So that was how I started, and for many years I worked as a physicist, a scientist. I worked on some of the things associated with the web, and eventually I helped to work out the beginnings of the W3C. Everybody knows the W3C. If you don't, you're in the wrong conference, in the wrong room. And I joined the HTML working group in 1996. And I'm not going to count up how many years that's been. It's been a few. There were a couple gaps in there. Basically when I was moving from one employer to another, or when whichever employer I happened to be working for was reluctant to join the W3C. I know that doesn't make a lot of sense. But so there were some gaps in there. But currently I am the longest serving member of the HTML working group, and have been involved in this since basically since the earth cooled. I've also been involved in a lot of other W3C working groups. I played a role in the development of the XML language and was on the original XML core group. I was on the XSLT group. I was on several others. I was, and I think I'll get some laughs for this, I was a member of the original namespaces group at W3C. Any survivors of namespaces in here? Walking wounded, PTSD? No, okay, so namespaces was a little vicious at the W3C. There's still some people that were on that group that, more than a decade later refused to speak to some of the other members of the group because of what happened. It was pretty vicious. So anyway, I've been involved in a lot of these working groups. I've been around for a long time, and I wanted to sort of share my perspective as an observer on what's happened with HTML over its lifetime, and maybe offer some thoughts about where it's going. Just before we get to that question, I'm a member of the HTML working group still, and still out there trying to make things better and make the world a better place. And in fact, when we get to the structure of the HTML spec, you can kind of see some of the things that we're currently working on. So enough about me. This talk is not really about me. I don't want to overemphasize the role that I've played. I want you to simply think of me as a fly on the wall in all of these big meetings. And with that being said, let's take a look at HTML's evolution over time. So I stole the left-hand side of the graph here from someone on the web who had a nice blog. His name's Vlad Alexander. I don't know him, but I stole the left-hand side of the graph from him, and then I added some more here to add a few things. So his timeline ended there at the publication of XHTML 1.1. This was a document that I actually wrote, and he sort of ended it at the point when that document first came out. And following on that, we had a midlife crisis for HTML, and we'll talk about that in a little while. XHTML2, anybody ever looked at this spec? It was a working draft. What? Nobody was paying attention to our favorite language? Shame on you. XHTML2 never really went anywhere, and we'll talk about why that was. We got the first draft from the WhatWG, I think in 2005 was the first draft, and then their first spec was 2009. We're going to get the official recommendation from W3C for HTML5 when? 2014. And in fact, we actually on the working group have a plan called Plan 2014. So if that seems like a long gap to you, well, it is. We'll talk about maybe why some of these gaps occur and why standards basically take forever. I put a couple other things in here also included in the HTML working group's plan is a plan for HTML 5.1, which covers a lot of things that never quite made it into the original spec or were added later, and that's due 2 years after that. And then I have sort of hypothesized a little bit about HTML6. Nobody has any real plans for HTML6. That's sort of there to frighten people in the audience into leaving the talk at this point. More seriously, we don't really know about HTML6, and right now we're still recovering from the efforts on HTML5. I don't think that it'll show up in anybody's email anytime soon. That being said, I'm going to skip forward a little bit from the years from 1990 to 1996. This was a period of professional change for me as I moved from being a physicist to being a web geek, and a lot of other things happened in that period. But I'm going to jump forward to 1996 and the browser wars. So Netscape was out, IE was out. They were both just about to release new versions, both of them version 4. Anybody here active in the web at that time during the browser wars? Awesome. So that was cool, huh? A lot of things going on. The screenshot here kind of illustrates something that I was working on, going from being a physicist to a lowly JavaScript programmer. And I actually wrote some JavaScript. This was originally supposed to be a bouncing ball demo, you know, the little breakout game. And when the Netscape 4 came out, we had layer. The layer tag for the first time. And we did not yet have iframes. That wasn't going to come along for a few months, but it was a similar concept. And so I wrote this little breakout game, and you can see some of the code here in the screenshot. I know it's really difficult to read. I didn't want to blow it up and make it overwhelm the slide, but if you actually look at that code, you'll see it was written in December of 1996, had been originally written by a couple guys at Netscape, and there were a bunch of bugs in it. So I had to go back and fix the bugs. And so this was what the status was about 1996. And of course, we were plagued with the Tower of Babel problem, because if you had actually been able to get to this page, you would have only been able to do it if you had had one or another version of IE or Netscape, but not either, but it wouldn't have worked in the other browser. And that's what we call the Tower of Babel problem. And we'll return to that because it's still with us, and that's unfortunate. So here's some code I wrote in 1996, and at this time there was a rather embarrassing article, in fact, where Mike McHugh of Netscape actually popped up and praised me as being the world's greatest JavaScript programmer. That was really, really embarrassing because I did not consider myself to be a programmer of any sort. JavaScript was brand new. Nobody was any good at it at all. One thing to note that's kind of interesting here, Doug Crockford, my colleague at PayPal, sits right next to me in the office, just finished his talk over in the room across the hall. And I told him not to go over so you folks could come and hear my talk. And so at this point in time, Doug Crockford had never heard of JavaScript. He had no clue about it. And I often tease him about that. You know, it's like, who was here first? More seriously, though, this is what it was like in 1996. And this was a serious time of innovation. We got a lot of new things on the web. Some of them were good. Some of them maybe not so much. Anybody remember Blink? Right? Okay, so not everything worked out really well, right? Now, of course, today we'd implement Blink with CSS3. Much more advanced. The upshot on the browser wars, nobody really won, and especially, and most importantly, users did not win. And it was clear that at that point that things were not going well for HTML. We needed to fix some things. So we held a workshop. The W3C held a workshop called The Future of HTML. It was in 1998. And I wrote a paper for that talk. It was called The Role of HTML as a Display Format. And here's the abstract to that talk here on the right. But basically what I was trying to get at was something closer to what we do with PostScript, where we send the actual presentation language to the device based on, you know, what device it is, what kind of printer or so forth, maybe a screen in the case of display PostScript. And that was sort of my thinking, that we would use HTML as a display format. And I argued for really controversial positions. Separation of content and presentation was really controversial at that time. Okay, nobody's laughing because it seems so silly now to even talk about it. But at the time, this was a serious argument. Should we really separate the presentation and the content? So the talk argued for that. It talked about writing content for specific devices, and also talked about some other things. The worst thing about this talk was it was horribly embarrassing when I was actually at the workshop and gave the talk. I was trying to be super fancy and super advanced and give a presentation in HTML with CSS and JavaScript. All this was new, and my presentation failed miserably. I mean, it just bombed totally. I couldn't get the screen into 640 by 480 resolution, if anybody remembers that. And the whole thing was just hideously embarrassing. So it was one of those bad moments in my career, one of those cases where the demo gods, strike, and was a terrible presentation. But the paper actually turned out later to be pretty influential on the way HTML turned out. So if we go and look in 2013 at the role of HTML as a display format, I think that it's pretty fair to say that it turned out pretty much the way that I had talked about it in my paper, and I'm kind of proud of that. I didn't get everything right. The notion that we actually needed a lot of application support in order to separate the presentation and the content, right? If you're going to do that, you're going to increase API traffic. Things like that had not occurred to my small brain at that point in time. So I didn't quite get everything right. I'm giving myself an 80 on this paper, and actually think that it was pretty prophetic in some sense, but also I blew it in a couple ways. So that brings us to the end of the browser wars, and we knew something had to be done, right? It just simply wasn't going to work with all the browser manufacturers going their own way, with the rise of more serious data on the web. It's not so much the browsing experience that we had seen before, but we started to for the first time to see true applications, and those applications required a little more rigor around the markup than we had seen before. So we invented XML. I didn't invent it. Tim Bray and John Bosak at Sun actually invented it. I happened to work at Sun at that time. I have suffered in my career from a number of experiences of being in the right place at the right time, or maybe at the wrong place at the wrong time, depending on your viewpoint on these things. But I was there when the HTML rocket took off, and actually had read the original transcript of the discussion that Scott McNeely had with Tim Bray on why XML was going to happen, whether anybody liked it or not. So we went forth, and XML was essentially a Sun creation to a large extent, and was developed there at Sun. Most of the people involved were at Sun, and our goal was really to sort of apply some rationality to something that we thought of as an overgrown lawn of weeds. And we never intended to kill XML. There was a lot of news, and my former employer at this point, CNET, actually put out articles, XML is going to kill HTML. And of course, those of us sitting there on the XML group, and at this time I was on both working groups, XML and HTML, this made us a little, it led to some uncomfortable conversations in the HTML working group. They're like, oh, over in the other group, you're trying to kill us. And so there was a little bit of fun about that, and we were very naive in our thinking about the XML, the development of XML and how it was going to come out. Our original intention was we were going to do XML core, XSLT, Xlink, and XML schema all in one spec in 6 months. 12 years later, we're still at it. I think the xQuery spec came out yesterday, and or maybe it was the day before, I don't remember. But so we were a little bit naive about the standards thing. We were going to get a lot done in 6 months, and of course that didn't last past the first planning meeting. But a little bit of naivete, and so we saw the base for constructions of XML start to come out, the core, the style sheets, the linking and hypertext facility, and the XML schema. For myself, I was actually on the XSLT, the XML core, and the XML schema group. I was not on Xlink. Eve Mahler held down that fort and did a great job at it. She also worked at Sun. Almost everyone involved in the at this point was a Sun person. And so we went forth and we did this, and XML had this huge impact on HTML, but it didn't break anything, right? We did not replace HTML with XML. We simply XMLified HTML, and we'll get to that in a minute. But I wanted to sort of count the wins and losses. There's a lot of these. There's a much longer list. If you went and talked to Tim or you talked to Stephen or some of the other people involved, you would easily get some ideas on how much we won and lost. Norm Walsh certainly has his opinions on these things. But just counting them off first, I'd say that the first big win, XHTML, probably the most powerful and important spec ever written. On the other hand, most of the other specs bit the dust hard. And if you look around, the uses for XQuery and XPath and XLink are very few. And even though we continue to work on them, they have relatively narrow areas where they're being applied. XSD turned out to be too complicated, so did XSLT. There were a number of reasons for that. There was the objections to XML being verbose. I'm not sure what people were really thinking about this when it was originally put together. It was pretty clear that you're going to have to wrap a lot of things in tags, and there's going to be a lot of extra characters. That seemed pretty straightforward to all of us on the group, and we didn't regret it. We recognized that it was a price we paid to have the structure in the data in some way that was, and this is important, was understandable to human beings. We could have made XML a lot simpler and a lot less verbose at the cost of not letting everyone write it. And we'll talk a little bit about that later, but we decided to adhere to one of the base values of the web, which is that everyone gets to play, and you don't have to have a lot of money and a lot of fancy tools in order to do this. So that was what our thinking was. And a lot of it turned out not to work out so well. It was very verbose. A lot of people used XML for things we never intended. Nobody really ever thought about, well, this is how we're going to encode the database result set. And that was never in on our agenda. Mobile devices had a huge effect on the adoption of XML, simply because parsing doesn't work all that well on the mobile devices. So JSON Rose is an alternative, and it's a good one. It works really well in a lot of cases where XML doesn't. We've started to see sort of a divide in the community where we're starting to see rational uses for XML and rational uses for JSON, and that's not a bad thing. But for those of us who are involved in XML from the very beginning, it kind of looks like, we could have done a better job in thinking about some of these things. So XML came along. It did not manage to kill HTML, thank goodness. But there was a long period here wherein things were ugly, and you would not have wanted to be there to see the sausage being made. The XMLifying HTML was hard, and we offended a lot of people. A lot of people accused us of breaking the web. For a couple years after we published the original XHTML 1.0 spec, whenever I would get up on stage to give a talk or a presentation, people would come up to me and say, "You broke the web. I wanted to write my tags in uppercase. And you broke it." And I heard this hundreds and hundreds of times of people who had habitually written their tags in uppercase, just like we sometimes do with SQL or some other things, right? And they were just totally offended that the HTML working group had changed everything to lowercase for some rather obvious document management reasons, but very offensive to people. I had a lot of people, and this was sort of surprising to me and to the other people on the working group. I've had a lot of people who missed frame set. And I'll admit that I can't fathom that one at all. The idea that the back button doesn't work just is naturally offensive and whatnot. But I've had people tell me, frame sets made things a lot easier. I'd really like to have them back so I could use them on my website. Can you fix HTML, please? And I'm like, no, if I could have fixed HTML, this would have been done many, many years ago. But be that as it may, a lot of people were very unhappy. Nobody was satisfied. Really, nobody was happy with it, including those of us who had worked on it. And so we got up to a point where, we put out XHTML, or we put out HTML4, and HTML4 was sort of the last SGML-based version of HTML, and it had been in the works for a while. We made some changes knowing that XML was coming to make XMLifying it easier. And then we put the world through a lot of change in the course of 2 years. So we came out with HTML4, XHTML1, and then XHTML 1.1 modularization, all in the course of 2 years. And these were major changes to the language and its structure and the way it was parsed. We didn't change so much about which tags, we didn't add a lot of tags. What we were doing was repaying technical debt that had been incurred in the original construction of HTML. So we had to pay that debt. Nobody was very happy about us. And then there was this sort of long break. And I had been the author of the modularization spec and had fought with that for a long time. And how long exactly, I think you can kind of see here on the screen. So I wrote the first draft of this document on the 6th of April. Actually, I wrote it around Christmas of 1998. And just because the way the W3C process worked at the time, it took till April to actually get a draft out. And this was part of me sort of coming up to speed on W3C processes. It was sort of arm wrestling within the group of authors on this thing. But anyway, 1999 we started. And finally we got to a recommendation on the 29th of July, 2010. 11 years, 3 months and 22 days. Yes, I was counting them. I really was. It's sort of interesting if you go to the W3C's website, you know, they have these links for previous version and so forth. If you go back and click on those, it's very interesting because you can see all the different places that I've worked over the course of HTML's history. So you can see I worked at CNET when the original document came out, and over the course of, you know, several employers later, you know, I ended up actually being at Sun when this was originally published. So it took one hell of a long time, and it should not take anything like that long to do these things. When I showed you the graph earlier and I said, well, we're going to get HTML5 in 2014, HTML 5.1 in 2016, you can see that the previous version of HTML took 10 years to really make its way through the belly of the beast. Right, we're in for a long haul, guys, and the things that we can do to make that shorter are really important, and we'll talk a little bit about that, but the process just takes too long. And this was why we had the insurrection from the WhatWG. So this was a controversial slide. It took me 4 or 5 drafts to write this slide in such a way that I could actually stand here and stomach reading it to you, and also be nice and polite and non-contentious and all the things we're supposed to be when we give public talks, because this was a very contentious issue. The HTML went into its midlife crisis, went and bought a Porsche, started looking at younger women. No, just kidding. Seriously, HTML went through this process where nobody was really happy with it. Everybody wanted massive change. Nobody could agree which direction the changes should go. And so some folks decided they were going to go off and force change on the rest of the community who might have been reluctant, including the W3C. So they started up the WhatWG and moved forward with that. And I'm not going to go into all of the details around what happened there. I'm just going to simply say that, you know, the spirit of reason prevailed. And eventually the WhatWG and the W3C got together, and they managed somehow to live happily ever after, or maybe not so happily all the time, but we try. And I'm not going to go too much into the controversies around this. I'm going to leave that slide where it is and leave that story untold, or maybe I'll tell it at the HTML5 DevConf. Be that as it is, where are we now? So I showed you this a little bit earlier, but I just wanted to reinforce it because it's so darn crazy, right? We're looking at actually having recs for 5 and 5.1 in 2014 and 2016 respectively. Anybody think that's too long? Anybody think that's just about the right time? All right, so we got some people who've worked on standards back here in the back. I can tell. Honestly, these things are taking too long, but they're not taking you know, an order of magnitude longer than they should. They're taking 20 or 30 or 40% longer than they should. And so 5 years is not an unreasonable time, given the fact that we need, you know, implementations. People have to write things and approve them and argue about them. But 10 years, 11 years, 3 months and 22 days, far too long. So what did we end up with? After all these fights, we started out with a few tags, didn't even have an image. Tim put together some sort of pseudo SGML type of stuff. And over the years, what did we end up with? HTML5 is really a federated model. And when I say it's a federated model, what that means is that it only exists and has any basis with the support of a lot of other dependencies. HTML is no longer a freestanding language. When it first started, you could type some HTML into a piece of code in VI, run it in the browser, no JavaScript, no CSS, nothing, worked fine. Then we started gathering these dependencies, CSS, JavaScript. We got the turducken problem that Doug Crockford likes to talk about, and we still have. I like to think of it as sort of a riddle wrapped in a mystery, shrouded in enigma, but be that as it may, we started gathering these dependencies, and if we start to look, I just wanted to call out all the different things that we depend on in this ecosystem. So the diagram here on the left was made by a guy, Sergei Mavrodi. I didn't make it myself. These are sort of famous pictures that are out on the web. I think most people have seen these. And he sort of diagrammed the core HTML5 and then some dependencies and then a lot of other related technologies there. And in the blue over here, we just have a list of those core technologies. And you can see that out of that list, I have dropped HTML microdata. And that's because the HTML working group decided to publish microdata as a note 2 weeks ago, because none of us had time to act as an editor for that document. I actually was going to edit that document and decided that I don't have the time to do it either. So just to give you an idea of what's changed between HTML in the old style and the new, just this one little pie slice here labeled HTML markup was all of XHTML. And everything else has been added, and that's just the core. And then there's all these other associated technologies around it. What we've got here is a federated model. And if you think about it, that's sort of a modularized application architecture, isn't it? So in some sense, you could think of HTML5 as being a pretty straightforward evolution from the very earliest days of HTML through 3, through 4, through XHTML, and on to the continuation of the federated model in HTML5. And I think that we're going to see even more federation over the next few years, and we'll get to that when I talk about my predictions for the future. So the important point here is that over time we move toward a federated model for this. Now this diagram does not tell the whole story, and I really wanted to blow this diagram up and give you an idea of just what a federated model for HTML really is. So on the right, or on the left, or on your right-hand side, we have HTML5, and then we have CSS3 over on the other side. And this is just that list of core technologies and related technologies. The colors in that diagram are basically to tell you its status at the W3C, and those have changed since these diagrams were put together. But when I looked at these diagrams, I felt they were really missing a lot. And so I added some things. So what ties CSS and HTML together? JavaScript. The document object model, right? What ties XML to HTML and CSS? The document object model, JavaScript. When this person was putting these two diagrams together, they very carefully, laid out everything about CSS, knows far more about the CSS space than I do, far more about these related technologies in HTML5, but he missed some serious points, right? The first one is that JavaScript is required for the modern web, and you can't leave it out. It's tightly coupled to the way that HTML works, and with the rise of the API specs in HTML5, even more so. HTML5 simply doesn't make sense in a lot of cases without JavaScript. XML is still a major part of the architecture of the web, has to be included here as well. All of these things come together in the center where we talk about the real central object on the web, which is the document object model. The DOM is central to everything we do. And I wanted to sort of call that out and describe what's going on here, because our real task as people who are acting as stewards of the HTML language is not to go out and create 50 new tags, You know, I can think of 50 new tags that, you know, that I've always wanted. I could add those or at least propose them. Our goal is not to do that, but to manage the coevolution of all of these specs all at once in such a way that we don't break the web. And that's really our job. And if you think that that's not a massive cat herding exercise, have a look at the screen and imagine talking to every one of the working groups. For every little dot on here or every little line, there's a working group somewhere, maybe more than one. And all of those people have to agree on how HTML moves forward and how the web works. I stole the title from this slide, by the way, from a famous book by a physicist. His name was Stephen Schneider. It's called The Coevolution of Life and Climate. And he talks about how this atmosphere has evolved over time to support life and how life supports that atmosphere. In just the same way, this little ecosystem we have here on the screen with HTML and CSS and JavaScript and XML forms its own little ecosystem, and it's only stable because everybody knows what they're supposed to be doing and everything works together. You could easily imagine writing a CSS spec that didn't work well with HTML, and in fact we've done that in a number of cases. If you go look at some of the XSLT stuff, was definitely not intended for HTML as a target. So we can build specs that don't work, and we can throw sand into the gears of this machine. There's always been a certain sense on the HTML working group that, you know, we were in the Asclepian position, right? First, do no harm. If we break the web, right, I'm going to hear a lot of different talks when I come up and give my next talk. It's not going to be about lowercasing tags. It's going to be about, you know, I'm going to shoot you and slash your tires. We can't break the web. And that's the one thing that prevents a lot of action in the HTML working group, is that any move we make has to work well with all the other people here on this screen. And all of their aspirations and goals have to be met as well. And that's a lot. It's very complex. We built ourselves a rather complex ecosystem. Managing it all is largely the W3C's job. Obviously, W3C doesn't own JavaScript, the ECMA group does, but there's close coordination between the ECMA script and the HTML5 working group, largely because Doug Crockford and I sit next to each other, which makes things a little easy. But really, this diagram sort of gives you a sense of how complex and fragile the web ecosystem is, and how much work W3C has to do to maintain all of this stuff, right? Think about what Tim's thinking, right, when he looks at this diagram. He's got to go into the meetings and make sure that sand is not inserted into any of these gears. That's complex, very, very complex. My own reasoning on modularization. So when the WhatWG came up with HTML5, they were very adamant about modularization has failed and we need to take a new course with HTML. And then we got HTML5, which is modularized. So it's difficult at this point to take a lot of the complaints that WhatWG made about this seriously. And at the end of all this, and looking at the end of HTML5, and we can kind of see what its shape is going to be, I actually feel like I'm a little bit vindicated in the path that I took with modularization, and that in the end, as much as people were protesting against it, we actually ended up modularizing HTML and doing exactly what we intended to do. We never anticipated WebSockets. We didn't put Canvas 2D into place, but we made those things possible, first by XMLifying HTML and then making the modularization of it possible so that these things could work together. So I'm counting this as a victory for the web, not for me. I wasn't the only person that worked on the modularization spec. The whole group worked on these things. But for the web, this is a huge victory because modularization makes it possible to do a lot of the things that we simply weren't able to do, like serve mobile devices well. Anybody know Jake Nielsen? Usability expert? So he came up with this nice word, contraptionary, which I think is a great word. You won't find it in any dictionary, but it describes the web pretty well. And so I pulled out two quotes here. One of them is a fictitious quote by George Bernard Shaw, who died several decades before the web was invented, but he said something similar. It was just simply about a dancing bear instead of the web, right? And what he said was that the wonder of it isn't how well it works. And honestly, the web doesn't work all that well, does it? That doesn't make us happy. but the fact that it actually works at all. And when I think about the diagram on the previous slide, the fact that it actually works at all is kind of amazing. But I wanted to juxtapose that quote with another little quote that I found on the WhatWG website, which I found to be disheartening, at the least. So this is the WhatWG's description of HTML5. This specification is a kitchen sink full of technologies for the web. All right, who wants to get up early and work on that? Right? I don't think so, right? HTML5 is not a kitchen sink of technologies for the web. It's a set of technologies that have been designed and in many cases tightly coupled to work together to make the web better. It's not just some smorgasbord. It's not like, oh, I thought of a new spec, let's add it to HTML5. A lot of this stuff has a lot of serious, intense thought about it, and I reject the WhatWG's characterization of it as some kitchen sink or grab bag of technologies. That being said, the web is contraptionary. It doesn't work as well as your television. And it's much, much slower, which is an odd thing if you think about the fact that the TV cable and the internet cable come over the same cable. A little odd why they're so much slower. We'll talk about that tomorrow in the performance boot camp. If anybody is going to that, I'm giving a performance boot camp tomorrow. All right, so another problem that we have yet to solve, the Tower of Babel problem. So when I put those little images on the previous slide, I was trying to illustrate something about the browser wars and the incompatibilities that led to the rise of XML. But I wanted to point out that many, many moons later, 2013, I still see little web bugs on people's pages says, you know, best viewed with Chrome. Right? Now, Chrome wasn't even around during the browser wars. Why do I have these things? Why do I still have the Tower of Babel problem? Why can't HTML solve this for me? Why can't HTML5 solve this for me? Well, it's just not that easy. We could if we want, if we could. We would if we could. It's just not that simple. What actually happens is that it's very difficult to write a spec that no browser maker can misinterpret or interpret differently than another browser maker. We write these things in English. They're written by human beings. And it's difficult to drive the sort of compliance into the specs that we would like to have. It's also the case that it's always a work in progress, as the sort of the slide templates indicate, right? It's always a work in progress, always different browsers in different states of completion, different states of implementation, right? Currently, the IE guys have WebGL in IE 11, but not in IE 10. Other browsers don't have IndexedDB yet. Some aren't going to implement WebSQL. There's all these various differences, and we have some websites, I think, that we all know where we go to check and see what's compatible with what. Those pages are a horror, visually disgusting, and very difficult to read, but they're very, very useful as well. But I wanted to point out that even after all these years of working on the HTML working group, trying to make HTML better, still have not solved this problem, and it's the same problem we've had. And I have even worse news for you. We're never going to solve this one. It's just not soluble given the current situation. So we can look forward to breaking things around the edges and less reliable pages than we would like, as long as the standards are in a state of ferment, as long as things are under a state of development. This is one of the problems that's implied with that. It's an occupational hazard. We're not going to really be able to solve it. So let's look at a few trends that are influencing HTML now and are going to play an even bigger role in the future. Obviously, I think it's fair to say at this point, mobile devices are driving what we do on HTML. It's not just an added thought, you know, we have this platform, we need to do that as well. At this point, mobile considerations are actually driving a lot of HTML's evolution. If you think about why local storage and IndexedDB are the way they are, they're actually that way because they needed to work on mobile. If you think about the way that the markup changes around columns and so forth, articles have changed. A lot of that's driven by mobile. Most of the new users are mobile users. We're starting to see the first generation of folks who may never have a desktop computer and maybe be pretty happy about it, right? My phone has never popped up and asked me to reboot. Anybody remember, you know, the abort, Valium, retry dialogues we used to get in Windows? So my phone never does that, and a lot of people are going to be mobile users forever and never even going to have a desktop, and they're going to be very happy about that. Coolest innovations in HTML. There's a lot of them. Anybody think WebSockets is cool? Canvas 2D, WebGL, all this stuff is super cool. A lot of it's being driven by mobile. This is one of our main drivers of our trends. I'm going to say something very heretical here. If anybody has a gun, please leave it, unloaded. My car is actually parked over there if you want to slash my tires. Mobile devices may force us to leave hypertext and documents behind. I know that's heresy, huh? I mean, it's hypertext markup language and hypertext protocol. But when was the last time you tried to scroll on your phone through a page with a bunch of links on it? Right? I mean, we all know this problem. Hypertext does not work very well at all on mobile devices. And if you think about the role of web design, even back in 1996 and ever since, a lot of the work that we do in design on the web is hiding the hypertext, putting in buttons and menus and navigation and all of these things that don't look like hypertext, don't look like blue links embedded directly into the text, right? A lot of the work that we've done has gone into disguising hypertext and making sure that it actually works well for the users. So when I stand up here and say that, maybe hypertext is past its sell-by, I know that, people are going to go and quote that in the papers and my talk will get a good review. But more importantly, the real issue is that hypertext may not turn out to be the best idea for the web, or it may have turned out to be an idea that worked really well at the beginning, but maybe doesn't actually have staying power. I'm okay with that. Really, I am. Right? We can remain true to our web and our web values, even if we have to leave the blue links behind. I think that would be okay. Users will still be able to get at their content. We don't really need documents. We haven't done documents for a long time now since Microsoft very cleverly invented the XHR. We haven't really needed documents, have we? But we still use them. Paradoxically, our APIs, based around document-based ideas, REST. So, a little bit of heresy for you. Mobile may make us change the nature of the web in more significant ways than we've anticipated. The line between application and documents is blurring. I don't think I have to belabor this point too much. I think everyone kind of sees this. This isn't news. It's not new. It's just that it's accelerating, and that a lot of things that we did in HTML5 were intended to address this, right? Once again, web storage, IndexedDB, web workers. Yay, web workers. I love web workers, right? But it's a threading model. We've added threads to the web, right? And that's an odd thing. Documents don't usually have threading models. So we're adding application type functionality to HTML5 over on the web apps working group at W3C. It's often difficult to tell which working group you're in. And you have to sort of step back and think, am I in HTML or am I in web apps? Oh, who's the chair? Oh, yeah, it's Charles. So I guess this must be web apps. But there's been cases where, web apps handed a spec off to HTML, HTML hands it off to web apps. The line between these things, even at the standards level, is starting to blur. Now, if we take the canonical definition of an application rather than a document, right, what we're really talking about is something that maintains state and has a well-defined set of user sequences, right, unlike a lot of browsing applications. If you think about that, people are definitely moving in that direction even for desktop web-based presentation. There's no question that application thinking, application development is changing the way that we do HTML. We're actually really writing real applications. We have the tools to do it for the first time. This is driving a lot of the change that you see in the HTML language and its associated dependencies. Obviously, we have things like Chromebook, Firefox OS, things like this. The hardware and the browser made it at or joined at the hip in a really significant way. And that, too, is a blurring of applications and documents. Rise of the API, this was a pretty straightforward thing after you had already watched it happen. If I had been smart, I could have predicted this, but I didn't really. But it's a straightforward consequence of what we've been doing. Separation of presentation and content, obviously going to lead to a lot of application traffic. APIs are big now. Significant portion of our HTTP traffic now is in the form of JSON and XML fragments, HTML fragments, often still based on documents. We all have heard of REST, whether it's a good idea or not. That's a different question. I'll I'll stay and fill you in on my arguments with Roy Fielding about that after the talk, if you'd like. But it's interesting that we have applications with document-based interfaces, isn't it? A little paradoxical. Some predictions for the future of HTML. So this one really worries me, this first one. The barrier to entry is going to get a lot higher real soon now. And that worries me because one of the fundamental values that we have as web developers, as web creators, as participants in this process, one of our main values, everybody gets to play. Not just the people who run big TV studios or radio stations, the way it is with radio and television. You can't get on there without going past those gatekeepers, right? And they have lots of money and they may not like you. Anybody can play on the World Wide Web, and that's a significant value. And I'm a little worried that as we add these complex technologies to HTML, that we'll lose sight of those values, and that it really will require a lot of money, time, effort, and college degrees in order to write HTML pages. And I really don't want to see that. XHTML isn't going away. How many people know that every web page today that's read by a browser is actually converted to XHTML in order for it to be parsed? Right? Every HTML document is XHTML. If you want to think about what the success of a spec means, when the software actually converts incoming input into the format of your spec in order to parse it, that's success. Every browser at this point is an XHTML parser. So it's not going away. A lot of people find it really useful. They'll add what parts of HTML5 they think are useful, and they'll leave the rest. That was what we intended. That's what modularized means. Applications will rule. A lot of this, once again, being driven by mobile. People are writing native front ends onto HTTP backends. Some of those use HTML as their formatting language. Others are using, the native underlying UI code. But either way, this is the web. It's using HTTP. And we're going to see a lot more of that, at least up until we get the performance for HTML5 to be similar to that of native applications on mobile devices. Applications are going to continue. Hypertext is past its sell-by. I've been saying this for a couple years in little dark corners to people that I thought wouldn't shoot me, but I'm going to go public here at HTML5DevConf and actually say HTML5 is getting to be, or HTTP, or HTML, sorry, hypertext. Let me be very clear. Hypertext is reaching its sell-by, and we're going to have to do something about that. One of the things that we could do is figure out how to do linking better. The poverty of hypertext on the web is amazing. Hypertext is extremely powerful, but only implementing very simplest one-dimensional links left us in a state where hypertext isn't powerful enough to do the things we want and still too complicated to do the things we need. If we reform hypertext, maybe we can save it. Otherwise, we'll find something else. HTML will continue to metastasize. So I talked about modularization in XHTML 1.1. We started to see modules for forms and all the various things, Ruby and things like this. In HTML5, now we've broken these things out and they're separate specs. And in the future, I suspect that that sort of metastasis will continue. It may very well be that the protocol-related aspects of HTML move to a different group or under a different governance rule. Does WebSockets really belong as part of HTML? I've never been quite convinced of that. I love WebSockets. I think WebSockets are the coolest thing since sliced bread. Not convinced that they're necessarily related to HTML in any way. That was just where they were thought up. So my prediction, we'll continue to see HTML metastasize. It will continue to change and grow, and we'll see a whole lot more of specs around specific technologies and ideas. One of the big things in HTML5 was around media. I suspect we'll continue to see a lot more media additions to HTML5. 5 predictions for the next time I stand up here and talk at the next DevConf. What about our values? Are we making the bar too high? I talked about this a little earlier, right? We want the web to be for everyone. Can we move beyond the basics, HTTP and HTML, and still retain the spirit of the www? Can we continue to evolve naturally and make these things work in a way that really works for users? I really don't want to see another period of stagnation like we saw in the early 2000s. That was a very sad time for everyone involved. And I actually considered leaving the working group at that point just because nothing was happening. Are we making the world still a better place? I'm going to leave you with a last thought. For this talk, you don't really want to thank me. The person you want to thank is here on the screen. So here's Tim. This is one of his better pictures. He takes some really bad pictures. He also talks too fast. That's where I learned it. And so this is actually a quote from the original paper that sparked off the World Wide Web, the original proposal. A couple interesting things you can see here. It was all one word. World Wide Web was actually one word. Bob Kailau was the co-author. He worked over in Building E. It was a different building than the building Tim and I worked in. This was the original talk. And if you really want to blame this on any person, it's not Dave Raggett, it's not Stephen Pemberton, it's not Shane McCarran, it's not me. We all were basically stewards for Tim's ideas, trying to make them better. Dave Raggett, I think, has probably been the one person I would blame other than Tim for the evolution of HTML. He's been involved from the beginning, and he's done most of the heavy lifting, and is still totally involved in the W3C. But anyway, I thought I would leave you with the idea that this is the person responsible. So when you want to complain about HTML, right, don't send me the email, send it to Sir Tim. And very carefully call him Sir Tim because that annoys him a lot. All right, so see you at HTML6 DevConf. I hope to see every single one of you.